He wasn't supposed to survive. The words hung in the cold air, almost like a whisper from the heavens themselves. The morning fog was thick over the mountains, swirling with a sense of foreboding. In the distance, a small group of figures stood, frozen in time, their faces painted with sorrow. Among them was a lone German shepherd, his amber eyes staring intently at the small mound of earth that marked the resting place of a fallen comrade. This was no ordinary dog. His loyalty ran deeper than the pain that tore at his heart. This was Max, and today, he carried a burden heavier than any human could ever understand. His brother in arms, Ben, had been lost to the horrors of war. And yet, Max refused to let go. He carried with him the collar of the one he had lost. Everywhere he went, every step he took, a silent tribute to a bond that had transcended the battlefield. The rest of the world had moved on, but Max could not. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to whisper Ben's name, and Max, in his grief, had never let go. He carried that collar with him, a reminder of the one who had been his partner, his companion, and his closest friend. As the wind picked up, Max sat down at the edge of the grave, his body stiff, his tail still. There was no sound but the faint rustle of leaves and the soft thrum of the world continuing around him. And yet, within Max, there was a storm, an ache that no one could heal. Chris Walker, the Marine who had walked beside Ben and Max through countless battles, stood silently beside his loyal dog. His own heart broke as he watched Max, his best friend, holding onto the past with such fierce determination. Chris had always known the bond between a Marine and his K9 was something unshakable, but seeing it now, in the quiet aftermath of war, it was more than just loyalty. It was love. Max's gaze never wavered from the collar, and Chris couldn't help but feel the weight of that loss. Max had been with him through everything, every mission, every heartbreak. And yet, the death of Ben had changed something inside Max. The dog had become quieter, more withdrawn, but there was an unspoken promise in his eyes. He would never forget. He would carry Ben's memory with him, no matter how much time passed. Chris reached out, gently placing a hand on Max's head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath his fingertips. The dog leaned into him, as if to say, "I'm not alone." Max had lost his brother, but he wasn't alone, and neither was Chris. Together, they would heal. Together, they would remember. As the fog began to lift, the sun peeked through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It was a quiet morning, but a new chapter was beginning. The bond between man and dog was a story that could never be erased, and for Chris and Max, that story would continue. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow over the quiet town of Silverton, Colorado. The air was crisp, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves on the old oak trees lining the street. Chris Walker stood outside the small cabin, looking out over the land. Max, his loyal German shepherd, sat quietly beside him, his head tilted slightly as he watched the world around him. The collar that once belonged to Ben lay nestled carefully in the dog's mouth, as though he was guarding a piece of his past that no one could ever replace. The loss was still fresh, but there was something different about this morning. Something in the air felt like a new beginning, even though the pain of the past still lingered in their hearts. Chris placed his hand gently on Max's back, feeling the warmth of his fur under his fingertips. It was a silent gesture of comfort, a promise that no matter how much time had passed, they would face the future together. Max's amber eyes met his, and for a moment, the bond between them was stronger than any words could convey. They had both lost so much, but in this quiet moment, they were not alone. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the cabin, Chris and Max set out on their walk. The path was familiar to them, winding through the wooded area that surrounded their home. The trees stood tall, their branches reaching up toward the sky, as if they too were mourning the loss of a friend. Chris's thoughts drifted to the days he spent with Ben and Max on the battlefield, the three of them fighting side by side, facing dangers together. It was a bond that could never be broken, even by death. But now, it was just him and Max. The silence between them was comfortable, a reflection of the years they had spent together. There was no need for words. Max had always been there for him, a constant companion in a world that often felt uncertain. Chris couldn't help but feel grateful for the dog by his side, even as the weight of the past pressed heavily on his heart. Max's steady presence was a reminder that no matter how dark the days got, there was always hope. As they reached the edge of the forest, Max stopped, his ears perked up as if he had heard something in the distance. Chris followed his gaze, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of danger. But there was nothing. It was just the quiet, the calm that came after the storm. Max looked back at him, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding, as if to say, "We're okay." Chris smiled softly, his heart swelling with affection for the dog who had been his anchor through everything. They stood there for a while, just looking out over the land, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on their faces. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were together, and that was all that mattered. The world had a way of moving on, of leaving people and memories behind. But in this moment, Chris and Max knew they had found something worth holding on to. As they turned to head back home, Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over him. He had come a long way since the days of war, and although the scars of the past would never fully fade, he had learned to live again. With Max by his side, he knew there was nothing they couldn't face together. No matter what came next, they would face it as a team. And for the first time in a long while, Chris allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future, one where he wasn't haunted by the ghosts of the past, but instead was able to honor the memory of those he had lost and embrace the new chapter that lay ahead. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden hue over the cabin and the forest that surrounded it. The air was crisp with the scent of pine, and the silence of the wilderness was only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. Chris Walker stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the expanse of land before him. Max sat beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon as if on alert, though nothing had disturbed the peace of the morning. Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment in the stillness. After everything they had been through, after the long years of war and loss, they had found a moment of peace. It was something he never thought he'd experience again, but here, with Max by his side, it felt possible. He rubbed Max's fur gently, feeling the familiar warmth of the dog against his hand. It was a silent bond, one that had been forged in the heat of battle and had only grown stronger with time. For a moment, Chris allowed himself to just be in the moment, to forget about the past and the ghosts that still lingered in his mind. It wasn't easy, but with Max there, he was beginning to let go. They had a long road ahead of them, but they would face it together. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the land, Chris and Max began their walk once again. The path was familiar, winding through the forest and past the small creek that ran through the property. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was soothing, a constant reminder of nature's resilience. Max trotted beside him, his steps light and sure, as if he too found comfort in the rhythm of the world around them. They passed the old oak tree where Chris and Ben had once spent hours, talking about life after the war, about what they hoped to find when they finally returned home. Ben had always been the dreamer, the one who believed that they could find a place of peace, a place where they could heal from everything they had seen and done. Chris had always been more practical, but Ben's optimism had always been a source of strength for him. Now, as Chris walked along that same path with Max by his side, he couldn't help but feel the weight of that dream. He wished Ben could have seen this moment, could have seen how far they had come, but he couldn't dwell on that. He had Max, and together, they would carry on the legacy that Ben had left behind. As they reached the clearing near the edge of the property, Chris paused and looked out over the rolling hills. The view was breathtaking, a sea of green stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a place that Ben had always dreamed of, a place where they could live without the fear of the past creeping up on them. It was as close to a fresh start as they would ever get. Chris felt Max nudge his hand, bringing him back to the present. The dog was always there, always reminding him that there was more to life than the memories that haunted him. With a sigh, Chris turned and began walking back toward the cabin, his heart a little lighter than before. He knew there would be tough days ahead, moments when the weight of the past would threaten to pull him under, but with Max by his side, he knew they would face them together. They were a team, and that was all that mattered. The future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. And for the first time in a long while, Chris allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The days began to blend together, each one passing quietly like the last. The mornings were filled with the soft sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the steady flow of the creek that ran behind the cabin. Chris Walker had settled into a routine, a peaceful existence that he had never imagined after everything he had been through. Max, his loyal German shepherd, was always by his side, a constant presence that grounded him, a reminder that even after the chaos of war, there was still peace to be found. As they walked through the woods together, Chris couldn't help but think about how far they had come. The pain of losing Ben, his comrade and friend, still lingered in his heart, but it wasn't as sharp as it once was. Time had softened the edges of that grief, and in its place was a quiet understanding that life had to go on. Max had been there through it all, never once wavering in his loyalty. It was as if the dog had an innate understanding of what Chris needed: comfort, companionship, and sometimes just the silent presence of someone who didn't need to say anything. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the land, Chris sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the open fields that stretched out before him. Max lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon as well. There was a serenity in the air, a feeling of contentment that Chris had never known before. It wasn't the kind of happiness he had once imagined, filled with excitement and adventure. No, this was something quieter, more profound, a deep sense of peace that came from knowing that he was no longer alone. He reached down and gently scratched behind Max's ears, smiling softly as the dog leaned into the touch. The bond between them had become something unspoken, but it was stronger than anything words could convey. As the sun set and the sky turned to shades of purple and orange, Chris thought about the future. He had once believed that he would never find a place of peace, that the memories of war would forever haunt him. But now, with Max by his side, he was beginning to see that maybe there was more to life than the scars of the past. The world was still full of beauty, still full of moments worth living for. And he knew that no matter what came next, he and Max would face it together. The stars began to appear in the sky, twinkling brightly against the darkening backdrop. Chris sat quietly for a moment longer, savoring the stillness, before getting up and heading inside. Max followed him, his steady footsteps echoing in the quiet night. They didn't need to speak, they never did. Their connection was enough. The cabin was warm and inviting, a safe haven from the world outside. Chris settled into his chair, Max curling up at his feet, and for the first time in a long while, Chris allowed himself to relax. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. He had found peace, not just in the world around him, but within himself. And with Max beside him, he knew that whatever the future held, he would be okay. They were a team, and that was all that mattered. The quiet of the morning settled over the cabin once again. Chris Walker stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretched before him. The world felt peaceful, almost surreal, compared to the chaos he had once known. Max, his faithful German shepherd, stood beside him, his watchful eyes scanning the horizon, alert as always. It was as if the dog had an innate understanding of the world around him, sensing things that others could not. Chris had spent years in the midst of war, surrounded by noise, chaos, and uncertainty. But now, in the stillness of this small cabin in the mountains, he was learning how to appreciate the silence. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. He had found a place of peace, a refuge from the memories that once threatened to drown him. Max had been his constant companion through it all, a silent guardian who never wavered. With the dog by his side, Chris had begun to heal, bit by bit. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't erase the scars of the past, but he could find peace in the present. He could live for the moments that mattered now. As the days passed, Chris and Max settled into a rhythm, finding comfort in their shared solitude. The mornings were spent walking through the woods, the afternoons filled with simple tasks: chopping wood, tending to the small garden behind the cabin, and sometimes just sitting together in the quiet. There was a peace in these moments, a sense of connection to the earth, to the world that had been waiting for him to return. Max's presence was a constant reminder of what he had fought for, of the bond they shared. The dog had saved him in ways that Chris couldn't explain. It wasn't just in the physical sense, though Max had always been there when Chris needed him most. It was in the way the dog understood him, in the way Max seemed to know when Chris needed space and when he needed comfort. It was in the way Max never judged him, never questioned him, and never left his side. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cabin, Chris found himself sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Max lay by his feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes soft with contentment. Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude, not just for the quiet life they had built, but for the dog who had stood by him through it all. It had taken time, but Chris had begun to understand that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And as long as he had Max by his side, he was willing to take that journey, one step at a time. The wind howled softly outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them like a protective embrace. Chris looked down at Max, the dog's eyes meeting his with an unspoken understanding. In that moment, he knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The past was behind them, and the future was a mystery they would unravel side by side. With Max beside him, Chris had found something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The days had turned into weeks, and Chris Walker had begun to find a rhythm in his new life. It wasn't the life he had once imagined, but it was a life that felt right. The cabin in the mountains, with its quiet solitude, had become a sanctuary for both him and Max, his ever-faithful German shepherd. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and in its imperfections, they had found peace. Each day, Chris woke early, just as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. He would stretch, take a deep breath of the cool morning air, and then set about the day's tasks. Max would follow him, always by his side, his presence a constant reminder of the bond they shared. They worked together, side by side, tending to the garden and repairing the cabin where needed. Max had become more than just a companion. He had become Chris's anchor, a silent force of strength that steadied him when his thoughts wandered back to the past. The weight of war still lingered, but with Max beside him, Chris no longer felt as if he was drowning in it. He was learning how to let go of the past and embrace the present, to move forward instead of being trapped by the ghosts of what had come before. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Chris sat outside on the porch, looking out at the horizon. Max lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in contentment. The stillness of the evening was broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of an owl. It was in moments like these, surrounded by nature and the quiet companionship of Max, that Chris felt truly at peace. He had spent so many years running from his emotions, burying them beneath layers of distraction and duty. But now, here in the calm of the mountains, he was beginning to understand that peace didn't come from forgetting the past. It came from accepting it, from learning to live with it. As the days passed, Chris began to open up more to Max, sharing his thoughts and feelings out loud. The dog never judged him, never interrupted, simply listened with an understanding that only a loyal companion could offer. There were no words needed. Max seemed to know what Chris was going through, offering comfort in his silent way. It was during these quiet moments, sitting on the porch with Max by his side, that Chris realized how far he had come. The pain of losing Ben, of all the sacrifices made in the name of duty, would always be a part of him. But it no longer defined him. He was more than his past, more than the memories that haunted him. He was a man who had survived, a man who had found a new purpose in the love and loyalty of his dog. As the fireflies began to dance in the air and the night settled in, Chris looked down at Max, who was now curled up at his feet. There was a sense of contentment that settled over him, something he hadn't felt in years. With Max by his side, he knew that no matter what the future held, he would never face it alone. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Chris felt ready to walk it, step by step, with Max as his companion. The seasons had shifted, and winter had begun to creep over the mountains. The first snowfall of the year had blanketed the cabin and the surrounding forest in a thick layer of white. Chris Walker stood by the window, watching as the flakes drifted down from the sky, covering everything in a serene, silent coat. Max lay curled up by the fire, his usual alertness softened by the warmth of the room. It was moments like this, when the world outside seemed to pause, that Chris felt a deep sense of peace. The fire crackled in the hearth, its orange glow casting shadows on the walls, and for the first time in a long while, Chris felt no rush. He didn't need to be anywhere or do anything. He was here, with Max, in this quiet cabin, far from the noise of the world. Over the months, they had both grown accustomed to this slower pace of life. Chris had found solace in the stillness, in the routine of waking up each morning with Max by his side, walking through the snow-covered woods, and tending to the small chores around the cabin. It wasn't a life he had ever imagined, but it was the life he had found, and it felt right. Max, always a step ahead, seemed to understand the rhythm of the seasons. The dog's coat had thickened as the temperature dropped, and he moved through the snow with the same grace he had shown through the summer months. Chris admired the way Max never seemed bothered by the cold, how he could move through the harshest conditions with ease. It was as if the dog had become a part of the land itself, as if he had always belonged here. Chris thought about how much he had changed since coming to this place. The man who had arrived at the cabin months ago, battered by the weight of war and loss, was not the same man who stood there now. Time had healed some of his wounds, though not all. The scars, both physical and emotional, would always be a part of him, but they no longer defined him. He had found something more important: peace. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Chris found himself reflecting more on the past, not with the pain he once felt, but with a sense of acceptance. The memories of his time in the military, of Ben and the bond they had shared, were still there, but they no longer haunted him. He could remember the good times, the camaraderie, the moments of laughter, without the sharp sting of grief. Max had played a big part in this healing. The dog's loyalty, his unwavering companionship, had given Chris something to hold on to. He wasn't alone anymore. Every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. Chris had come to realize that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about moving forward, embracing the present, and cherishing the moments of peace he had found. The world outside was still cold and unforgiving, but inside the cabin, there was warmth. The fire flickered as Max stretched, his body moving with a fluid grace as he rose to his feet. Chris smiled softly as the dog padded over to him, sitting by his side, as if asking for nothing more than to be there. In that moment, Chris knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Max was more than a dog. He was family, and that bond was unbreakable. Chris looked out the window once more, the snow still falling softly, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel at peace. He had found his place, and with Max by his side, he knew he was home. The cold wind howled outside, carrying the scent of snow and pine through the cracks of the cabin's windows. The fire crackled, its warmth spreading through the room as Chris sat in the armchair by the hearth. Max, ever the loyal companion, lay beside him, his head resting on Chris's feet. It had been several months since they had first arrived at the cabin, and each day brought them closer to a life they could both call their own. Chris had grown accustomed to the stillness, to the quiet of the mountains, but tonight, there was a subtle shift in the air. As he stared into the flames, memories of the past began to stir. His life before the war, before everything had changed, seemed so distant now. He could still remember the days when he thought he had it all figured out. The future had seemed clear, the path forward bright with possibilities. But war had a way of erasing those dreams, leaving behind only the scars of what had been lost. The loss of Ben, the bond they had shared, the brotherhood that had been torn apart by tragedy. These things still weighed heavily on Chris's heart. But as he sat there in the warmth of the fire, with Max by his side, he realized something. The past was still a part of him, but it no longer had the power to define him. He had moved beyond it. Max had helped him realize that. The dog had never questioned him, never asked him to forget. Max had simply been there, every step of the way, offering the kind of unconditional love that only a dog could give. It was that love that had slowly pulled Chris out of the darkness. It was that love that had helped him begin to heal. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, but inside the cabin, there was a peaceful quiet. Chris closed his eyes, allowing the warmth of the fire to seep into his bones. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He wasn't haunted by the past. He was here, in this moment, with Max. And for that, he was grateful. As the night stretched on and the fire began to die down, Chris stood and stretched his tired limbs. Max stirred, lifting his head to watch Chris move. There was a sense of understanding in the dog's eyes, as if he knew exactly what Chris needed. Without a word, Max followed Chris to the door, waiting patiently as Chris grabbed his jacket. The cold air hit them both as they stepped outside, but it didn't matter. The world was quiet, the snow falling gently around them as they walked through the trees. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind of silence that only comes from years of companionship. As they reached the edge of the forest, Chris stopped and looked up at the sky. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the black canvas of the night. It was in moments like these, when the world felt so vast and still, that Chris realized how far he had come. He had survived the worst of what life had thrown at him. He had lost so much, but he had found something else: peace, purpose, and a bond with a dog that would never fade. Max nudged his hand, bringing Chris back to the present. Without a word, they turned and walked back toward the cabin, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The first signs of spring began to show, the snow melting slowly as the sun took hold of the land. Chris Walker stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the ice-cold streams begin to flow freely again, the earth slowly waking from its winter slumber. It had been months since he had arrived here with Max, his ever-loyal German shepherd. What started as a refuge from his past had transformed into something more. Each day, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. Max's presence, his steadfast loyalty, had made all the difference. The bond they shared had become a source of strength for Chris, a reminder that even in the most difficult of times, there was always someone to rely on. Max trotted up to him, his coat thickening with the changing seasons. The dog's eyes, as always, were watchful, taking in everything around him. There was a calmness in Max's demeanor that Chris had come to admire. No matter the circumstances, the dog seemed to be unfazed, always steady, always there. Chris had learned a lot from Max in the time they had spent together. The simplicity of Max's life was something Chris envied. He didn't dwell on the past, didn't worry about what lay ahead. He lived in the moment, appreciating the things around him without hesitation. It was a lesson Chris had been slow to learn, but now, standing at the edge of the forest with the dog by his side, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The days weren't always easy, but with Max beside him, Chris had started to embrace the stillness, the quiet moments that used to scare him. The idea of peace, true peace, had once seemed impossible, but now it felt within reach. It wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the pain. It was about accepting it and choosing to move forward. Max had taught him that, without even trying. As the days grew warmer, Chris found himself spending more time outdoors, walking through the woods with Max, exploring the land they had come to call home. The quiet beauty of the mountains was something Chris never thought he would experience. After everything he had been through, he thought he would always be running, always searching for something. But now, with the world at peace around him, he realized he had found it. He had found a place where he could finally rest. The past wasn't gone, but it no longer held him hostage. Max had shown him the power of loyalty, of living in the moment, of trusting in something greater than the pain of the past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Chris and Max sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. The air was warm, the gentle breeze a reminder that the world was still full of life. Max lay beside him, his head resting on Chris's lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. In that moment, Chris felt the weight of everything he had been through. But it was different now. He didn't feel burdened by it. He felt lighter, as if the years of sorrow had slowly been replaced by something better, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of hope. Max's quiet companionship had given him a new outlook on life. The future no longer seemed so uncertain, so daunting. He and Max would face it together, one day at a time. The world outside might still be unpredictable, but for now, in this moment, Chris knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at home. The quiet mornings had become routine now, the sound of the forest around Chris Walker's cabin filling the air with a kind of gentle reassurance. The snow had melted completely, leaving behind the promise of spring. Birds began to chirp again, and the trees were beginning to sprout their first buds of the season. Max, ever vigilant, was at Chris's side as always, his presence a constant reminder of the bond that had grown between them. They had been through so much together, and yet, every day felt like a new beginning. Chris had learned to appreciate these moments of stillness, to embrace the life they had carved out for themselves in the mountains. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer held him captive. He had made peace with it, finding a kind of freedom he never thought possible. Max's loyalty had been a key to his healing, the dog's unwavering presence giving Chris the strength to keep moving forward. The mornings were spent walking through the woods, the sunlight filtering through the trees, creating patterns on the forest floor. Chris had grown accustomed to the slow pace of life in the mountains, finding solace in the quiet walks with Max. There was no rush, no deadlines, just the steady rhythm of life. The dog was always at his side, trotting alongside him with that familiar grace, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Max had become more than just a companion. He had become Chris's guardian, his protector, and his best friend. Each day they spent together felt like a gift, a reminder of the healing power of loyalty and love. One afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the forest, Chris noticed a small patch of wildflowers beginning to bloom. It was the first sign of spring, the earth coming back to life after months of cold and silence. Chris knelt down to examine the flowers, feeling a sense of gratitude for the simple beauty of the moment. The weight of the past still hung around him, but in moments like this, it felt lighter, as if the earth itself was helping him heal. Max sat beside him, his head tilted slightly as he watched Chris. The dog's eyes seemed to say everything without words. "We're okay." For the first time in a long while, Chris felt a sense of hope for the future. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about moving forward, about living in the present and embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. As they continued their walk, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. The evening air was cool, but there was a warmth between them, a quiet understanding that everything would be all right. They reached the cabin just as the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. Chris smiled softly, looking down at Max, who was already making himself comfortable by the fire. The bond between them had become something unspoken, something stronger than anything Chris had known before. He had found peace, not by running from his past, but by accepting it, by learning to live with it. And with Max by his side, Chris knew he would face whatever came next with courage and strength. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. The seasons had fully changed, and the mountain air felt different now. It was warmer, but still crisp, the kind of warmth that felt fresh, new. Chris Walker stood in the garden behind the cabin, hands on his hips as he surveyed the small patch of land he had tended to for the past few weeks. Wildflowers were beginning to bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the faded brown of the winter months. It was a sign that life was returning, that everything was waking up from its long, cold slumber. Max trotted around the garden, sniffing the flowers with an air of curiosity, his usual alertness softened by the calm atmosphere. Chris smiled at the dog, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. It had been a year now since they had come to this cabin, seeking refuge from a past that refused to let go. The cabin had become more than just a shelter. It had become their home, a place of healing. Chris had always been a man of action, someone who believed in moving forward, in constantly striving to achieve something. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, he had learned to slow down, to appreciate the small moments, the simple things. He had learned to live without the constant pressure of the outside world, without the noise of the past. Max had helped him in ways that words could not express. The dog had been his anchor, his constant companion through the darkest times. And now, as they stood together in the garden, it felt as though they had both found a place of peace. Chris kneeled down to pull a few weeds from the soil, the smell of earth and fresh growth filling his lungs. He ran his hands through the soft dirt, feeling connected to something bigger than himself. The world was vast, and yet in this moment, everything felt right. He glanced over at Max, who was now lying in the sun, his eyes half closed in contentment. The dog seemed at peace, as if he knew the work was done for the day. Chris let out a soft laugh, the sound unfamiliar to him at first, but then, it felt natural, a reminder of the joy that could still be found in life. The day continued to unfold quietly, with Chris and Max working together in their own way. As the evening drew near, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cabin and the garden. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, And Chris stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, feeling a sense of accomplishment. They had come so far, and yet there was still so much to look forward to. The past was always a part of him, but now, it no longer controlled him. He had learned to live alongside it, to carry it with him without letting it define him. With Max by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. They had created something here, something that could never be taken away. They had built a life from the ashes of their past, and with each passing day, it felt more and more like home. As Chris walked back toward the cabin, Max trailing behind him, he allowed himself to feel hopeful for the future for the first time in a long while. They were together, and that was all that mattered. The warmth of the fire had filled the cabin once more, its crackling glow casting a soft light over the room. Chris Walker sat in his favorite armchair, Max curled up beside him, both content in the quiet comfort of the evening. The world outside had transformed into a serene wonderland of autumn hues, the golden leaves of the trees now carpeting the ground in a blanket of color. It was a peaceful sight, one that Chris had learned to appreciate after so many years of chaos and noise. Life in the cabin had become routine in the best possible way. Every day had its rhythm. The morning walks with Max through the woods, the tending of the garden, the quiet evenings spent reflecting on the day. Chris had come to realize how precious this simple life was, how the smallest moments of stillness held the most meaning. He had started to let go of the urgency, the pressure to always be moving, always striving for something more. Instead, he had learned to live fully in the present, to appreciate what he had in front of him. The bond between him and Max had only grown stronger with time. The dog was always by his side, loyal and steady, offering a kind of companionship that Chris never expected. It was a silent bond, one built on trust and understanding, and it had become a lifeline for Chris. In the evenings, after the sun had set and the stars began to twinkle in the clear night sky, Chris would often sit on the porch with Max, watching the world around him. There was something about those moments, when the night air was cool and the silence was profound, that made everything feel right. The memories of war, of loss, of the pain that had once consumed him, had faded into the background. They were still there, of course, but they no longer held the same power over him. He had learned to live with them, to carry them without letting them define him. With Max by his side, he had found the strength to heal, piece by piece. One evening, as the stars shone brightly above, Chris found himself lost in thought. He gazed up at the sky, the constellations twinkling with quiet brilliance. It was in moments like these, when everything was still, that Chris realized just how far he had come. He had found peace, not by forgetting the past, but by accepting it. Max had shown him that it was okay to move forward, that healing was a slow, steady process, but it was worth it. The dog had taught him the power of loyalty, of love, and of being present in the moment. Chris reached down and scratched Max behind the ears, the dog's tail thumping softly on the floor in response. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. They had made it through so much together, and now, they were here, in this quiet cabin, building a life out of the fragments of their past. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Chris felt ready to face it. He had found his place, his peace, and with Max by his side, he knew he would never be alone again. The cabin had become more than just a refuge for Chris Walker and Max. It had become a sanctuary, a place of healing, and a home. The days passed in a gentle rhythm, each one blending into the next as the seasons continued to shift around them. Winter had turned to spring, and with it, new life began to take root, not just in the garden Chris had carefully tended, but also within him. He had started to believe again, not in grand dreams or distant hopes, but in the simple joy of living day by day, in the small victories that added up over time. Max, always at his side, was a constant reminder of the loyalty that had been with him through every dark moment. The bond between them had deepened, stronger than anything Chris had ever known. He had spent years questioning everything, his purpose, his future, the meaning of it all. But now, in the quiet of the mountains, he was starting to understand that maybe the answers didn't have to be so complicated. Life didn't always need to be about chasing something, about being somewhere else, about achieving the next thing. Sometimes, it was just about being, just about existing in the moment, with someone who understood you better than anyone else. That someone, for Chris, was Max. They had spent countless hours together, walking through the woods, sitting in silence on the porch, and working side by side in the garden. Max's presence had been a constant source of comfort. The dog was more than just a companion. He was a part of Chris, a reflection of the quiet strength that had carried him through the hardest times. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a soft golden light over the cabin and the surrounding land, Chris sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Max was lying at his feet, his head resting on his paws, content in the moment. It had been a long journey, but here they were, in this quiet corner of the world, building a life together. Chris had started to feel a sense of hope that had eluded him for so long. The past was still a part of him, but it no longer had the power to control him. He had accepted it, learned from it, and now, he was moving forward. The world outside was full of uncertainty, but Chris no longer feared it. With Max by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. As the evening grew darker, Chris stood up and stretched, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. He looked down at Max, who had now stood up to join him. The dog's eyes met his, full of understanding, and for a moment, everything was silent. There was no need for words. They both knew what was coming next. Together, they would walk through the night, step by step, side by side. The future was still uncertain, but they had each other, and that was enough. As they walked away from the porch, heading toward the woods, Chris felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had found something that he had lost long ago, a sense of belonging, of purpose, and most importantly, of love. Max had shown him that it was possible to find joy even after the darkest of times. And with Max by his side, Chris knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.